Welcome to the Central Valley Writers Workshop. Our Great Valley is home to many writers, all of whom are looking for tips, tools, and techniques to improve their writing abilities. Our hope is that you will get all of these and more as we interview authors and experts on our show. I'm Claudia Newcorn, author of the award-winning Chrysalis Chronicles of Fairy trilogies, magazine editor, freelance writer, and Modesto Bee community columnist. Today we have with us as our guest Clive Riddle, author of the absolutely fascinating crime mystery Doris Bridges. Joining me as our guest today and welcome you here. Thank you so much. We're glad to have you.
Well, thank you. This is the place to be.
Very much so, and I know our viewers are going to be very interested in learning a lot about your book and your background. Could you share with me actually a bit about your background and what motivated you to write a crime mystery, which
Sure.
really isn't something I would see going with what you do professionally?
I have lived in Modesto since 1977. I moved down here to go to college because where I grew up, there was no college. You had to leave home. I grew up in the very rural northeastern California, which becomes the genesis of why I wanted to do this book. And since moving here, I spent over 15 years working for a large healthcare corporation, running a health plan. And then had the opportunity in the mid-90s to get involved forming a company to do healthcare business information, primarily driven through the internet. And so I've been doing that ever since. The company, had its ups and downs with when the whole dot-com bubble burst, but we're doing quite well. And along the way, I evolved from really being a health plan CEO to becoming involved in publishing healthcare business information and writing myself, both in reference books or software or that. So writing is certainly something I developed as a passion. Since I was in college, I really always wanted to write a book, and I felt that the experience I had growing up in a very rural, isolated area was one that almost like the people I grew up with, is like we went to war together. It was a very unique shared experience, and I keep in a lot of contact. Just at the Super Bowl, I was together with 10 couples that I grew up with from 30 years ago.
Oh, wow. Now, what inspired you? You say you grew up in a small community and your story is set in more of a small rural town. Could you tell us a bit about the book and share some highlights about it with us?
Sure. The story, Doris Bridge, really is meant to operate at several levels. Probably at its base level, it is a crime mystery centering around a series of hit-and-run accidents and trying to solve who did that. And but it's also a father and son relationship story between the police chief of the town and his son, who's a senior in high school and a prankster and doesn't take life quite as seriously as his father. And so a lot of the story is looking at life through those two different lenses of both the father and the son. In addition to that, then, there are a series of what we call rural legends. I mean, everybody's heard of urban legends. You know,
Yes.
are typically urban and modern in nature. Alligators in the
sewer. I was just gonna
poodles in the
say that.
microwave. I had read those books about urban legends decades ago. That always fascinated me. But where I grew up, we had a different kind of storytelling. Again, the kind that you can never attribute. It's friend of a friend saw or heard this. But by rural legends, it more mean that it occurred, from a more historical versus modern.
Almost like a myth.
Yes, and as well in a rural setting. And so some of those stories that I had heard passed down as being fact, but could never, really be attributed to be actual fact, were ones that I wanted to weave into the story. So a series of what at first might seem very separate type of urban legends, here becoming rural legends, tie into the story, and they become interconnected as it goes along. So really the themes of it were to follow this crime mystery with a series of rural legends that start impacting things, with a father-son relationship where the son sees everything from a paranormal and kind of mystical point of view, while the father is very matter-of-fact and sees more earthly explanations for everything that's going on.
He's a police chief.
Yes.
It's cut and dried. It's black and white. the concept of rural legends, I thought that was an extremely unusual approach. You chose to use that. How many different rural legends did you weave into this story, and why did you pick and choose more than just one as underpinnings to what you were doing?
Well, again, part of my motive for the book was to write about life as it would be in an isolated rural area, where rural legends are really quite a fabric of life there, and one that was very central to what I recall as like mysterious lights that flash and appear out of nowhere. And where I wanted to weave in this story of some hit and run accidents, it came to me, well, the lights would help cause, a car to...
A correlation.
Yes, right, to have that. There was also the rural legend I had heard about this wandering band of nomadic Basques that lived out in the desert, in the Black Rock Desert.
Really?
People were convinced they exist, or that there'd be disappearing cattle that would somehow maybe from flying saucers or whatever. And of course, in the story, not all these things really have paranormal roots. It's just more, again, a legend.
Okay.
But it came to me to work that in as well, along with, of course, in any small town, there's the haunted house on the hill.
Yes, definitely.
And,
preferably a Victorian mansion, but anything will do.
Oh yeah, and where I grew up, there was an abandoned mansion on the hill. And so that I just had to put in there, and again, somehow interconnect them along the way.
Now, one of the things that you were doing with your story is you chose to put it in the 1970s. Was there a particular reason you chose that decade as opposed to either earlier in the century or more close to our time now?
Oh, the most obvious reason is I grew up there in the 70s,
Okay.
and you write what you know.
Yes.
But
very much
in
so.
addition to that, I wanted to, again, have this be a father-son story that if you're taking it from 2 points of view, I think I wanted the story to appeal to young adults now who could see the story through the eyes of Kyle Burgess, the high school senior. And for kids right now, a way to experience what their parents went through.
A double perspective.
I wanted to be able to provide a story in which, kids my own age might read that and say, oh, so this is what mom and dad were doing back in the 70s, if they happen to live out in a rural area. And then again, from a parent's point of view, trying to put myself in my father's own head and try and understand how the heck he ever put up with me or others like me, and view the world through that lens. So really the 70s allowed me to do that, to try to speak from my own experience. And there's one more reason, and that is the uniqueness of growing up somewhere where you're in a town of 2,000 and it's the biggest town in any direction for 100 miles. And the isolation of that is somewhat lost. I mean, now you have the internet, and you have Facebook, and you have, when I first was there, we didn't have cable TV. I mean, we had a couple channels.
Rabbit ears.
And that isolation brings about a little bit of a different culture. And so I wanted to write about a time that is partially lost.
Okay. One of the things that also struck me in reading some of your opening chapters is, as you said, you grew up in the 70s, but there's a challenge in catching the voice of a time period. For example, the internet isn't there. Telephone service as we know it probably wasn't that strong in your town either. What did you do to ensure that you, especially because you're involved in technology, you didn't accidentally blur your time divisions and bring things from the future back into the 70s? Did you have to do research?
I did.
To make sure? Could you talk about that?
I started, of course, you start from out of your own head.
Yes.
And hope that your memories ring somewhat true. But certainly I went back and pulled up a lot of mass media, both things that were more urban. I mean, Time magazines from back in that era, or, looking at some old commercials. It's fascinating to look at old commercials from the 70s. And then for the details I wanted to bring out, to go back and refresh myself and be very specific about those details. So I really tried, even though I started from memory, to research them enough and make sure that my memories were ringing true, and to comb through it and try and get rid of the slang that wasn't there in the 70s.
Exactly,
and purge that
the language.
out. And in the first draft, there was still some in there, but I tried to cleanse that and tried to use the terminology that we used. And granted, again, if you're growing up in an isolated rural area, your mode of speech is going to be a little different than somebody growing up in San Francisco. But I think I tried to make it ring as true as I could just to somebody growing up rurally in the 70s.
Well, now you have a lot of complicated plot lines. As you say, you've got the rural legends, you've got these hit and runs, you've got the father-son conflict. The young man is also in high school and all the angst that goes with that. What methods and techniques did you use to keep all these plot lines sorted out and make sure you didn't have loose threads flopping around by the time you were done?
Oh, sure. I started with a base layer and tried to add layers from there. The very beginning, I guess, when I first grew a passion to write a book, I was probably just getting out of college and I wanted to write about the experience of growing up in the rural North. The problem was, though, there wasn't a story driving it. And you can't really just write a book about, all your fun experiences. I didn't quite deserve writing a memoir at that point in life.
A blog might have worked, but they weren't around yet.
So, my next level was really to come up with the story. And I started to, when my kids were very young, they would want me to tell them stories. And I started telling them this story that worked around the lights flashing from nowhere, that various people had said they knew someone who'd experienced that, and working that into a hit and run accident. So that became the basis. And then I started building in things layer at a time from there. The first driving part of the story was taking the experience of the 70s in a rural isolated area and building in this hit and run mystery. Then I wanted to add rural history to it. I always liked reading like Michener, where there'd be in front of the main storyline would be these italicized little subchapters where you'd get a sense of the local history of whatever he was writing about.
Framing almost.
So I wanted to borrow that, and so I worked in a lot of local history into short little subchapters before I built the story really in chapters that went September 1975, October 1975, building throughout the school year of his senior year. In between, I would frame a little bit of some local history, and by local, more regional. Things about like the state of Jefferson, if anyone had heard of that, where the north part of the state tried to secede from California in 1942, and then worked that into with each of these little local history things. A bit of a theme that was brought up in the next chapter, so there'd be some relationship. So then I wanted to build in these little local history pieces. And after that, then it was just then trying to tie all the parts together. Now, how did I keep it from all not unraveling?
Well, yeah.
Was a word processor where I did a lot of find in Word, where I would, as things develop, go, well, wait a minute. Three chapters ago, did I not have him doing something that's different or conflicting with that? And I often would go in and have to, then search on whatever character I was at that time and check every point they were and make sure I was staying consistent. And I found, early on that there were places where I had to do corrections and that I had, said something contradictory along the way. I
found I would run into a similar problem, and I started using a technique where I actually keep what I call a tracker to the side, and I jot down key story notes. So as I'm going back, like yourself, I can say, okay, did Denai do this, or did Joseph do that? Where the heck are they in the story? Otherwise, as you say, you start to get lost and lose some very important threads.
I even had the problem with, with the characters. I compositized some of them from people I had known or that. And Freudian-wise, a couple times I slipped in names of actual people, where I'd already, I'd already used a character's name, but then one time I'd put, the name of who I was thinking of at that time when I was writing it. So I had to do a lot of searching to make sure I was using the right characters' names in the right conversations.
Well, you lead to a very important question. You really have what I call multidimensional characters. There's a lot of depth and complexity and humanity to them. Did you actually first sit down to develop the character, kind of map out who they were, maybe a bit of their background story, or did you just kind of dive in and see how the character developed themselves as you were writing the book?
You know, and I'm working on another book now where I'm doing the opposite. I've really mapped out the characters ahead of time.
Okay.
In this, they did somewhat develop along the way, and in fact, they surprised me. I ended up, as I was writing it, having them do some things very different than what I had in mind for them before, because all of a sudden things just evolved, and now I'm going to have them do this, and it wasn't anything I had in mind at first. And I definitely, with the most central characters, had it fairly mapped out. For the other characters, less so.
They sort of fleshed themselves out as you went along. It sounds like you hit one of those wonderful points as a writer where you're not writing, the book is writing itself, and you just happen to be taking the notes as you go along.
No, it did feel schizophrenic at times.
And we'll be right back with Clive Riddle.
Quality, experience, integrity. Countryman's Village Jewelers, in business over 40 years, exemplifies these characteristics with timeless classics to custom designs. Countryman's Village Jewelers features gifts for this holiday season at under $100. Countryman's Village Jewelers in McHenry Village, the jeweler you can trust.
And we're back with Clive Riddle, author of Doris Bridge. All writers encountered hurdles and challenges in the process of writing. What were some of the ones you ran into, and how did you overcome those?
Well, several things come to mind. Certainly, I should have involved an editor earlier in the process.
Why?
Because I ended up getting good advice from a few trusted advisors and an editor. That after I had finished the first draft, and I ended up making some major changes. It's a lot of work.
Oh yes.
And had I think sought more input earlier on, I could have avoided some grief along the way. And so most definitely, I think it would have been better to have gotten some counsel earlier on in the process. A second thing was really, of course, coming to the realization of what I could and couldn't do from a copyright standpoint. I really, to try and give the tenor of the 70s in this, worked in a lot of references to music, and quotes or, books, movies, and that. And originally, I was quoting lyrics throughout that, and then I researched copyright, law enough, and talked to, in publishing in that there's a limit to what you can and can't say, and so I had to back off of a lot of the concept that I think had I really thought that through ahead of time, I wouldn't have wasted some effort, with that. But really, I didn't have a lot of major regrets in how it went. I think by and large, I didn't encounter obstacles other than I took on an opus. Many books are shorter in length than what I did here, and I would caution anyone who wants to read it, they're not going to get it read in a night.
It's not a sit down, read, and come up for air in a couple of hours.
Yeah, it's probably double the length of a short, it's 300 pages or so.
Oh, but that's a nice meaty piece of reading. And I know you said young adults can read it as well as going to the teens, the tweens, and on up to full adults.
But, so a challenge, of course, if you're going to write something of that proportion, the challenge is just to stick with it, and that you're going to be doing a lot more writing than you would if you were taking on something lesser in scope.
Did you expect the book to be that long, or did that just happen?
Yeah, no, I from the very beginning knew I wanted to write the course of a school year.
Okay.
The entire senior year with this, with these mysteries unfolding as it went along, and then to work in a surprise end.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned a couple times the editing where you have your first draft. Could you share a bit with us what was involved in your taking your very first draft, because no one writes a perfect first draft, no matter what anyone says, and polishing it and culling it and perhaps having others look at it to bring it to fruition?
Sure. Well, several things. Of course, the easy thing is all the, even though you're using a word processor, there's just a lot of typos.
Oh, yeah.
And not so much, I mean, spell check just won't do it because you're using words in the wrong context, or, accidentally putting a different character name where you meant another, those type of things. And that's the easy part. But with the input I got, I guess the first was I initially introduced a fire hose of characters. And
That's a great visual. I love that.
And so I had to go back and just reduce the number of characters. That was a lot of the major input I got from my editor and from others who read it. Is they loved all the characters, but there were too many to track. So I started compositizing some of them or just eliminating them. And that, of course, becomes a domino effect throughout the book.
Yes.
So, there was that to deal with. And then my style, when I originally wrote it, was to be very conversation driven. Basically, each chapter that followed a month of the school year was driven primarily through conversation. Then there'd be these little, short chapters in between with the history that was told from a narrative standpoint. Well, the input I got was that I was way too dependent on conversation, and that
Interesting, really.
I still liked it as a style, but I wanted to go with after I had a number of trusted people looking at it. So I went back in the editing and changed some of the conversation into just narrative.
Now, it's funny when you say that, because so often people now say conversation is the style. To have people ask you to bring in some more narrative and I suspect some more texture. That's a very interesting reverse there.
So, well, there's still plenty of conversation. I liked conversation. I had a lot of it. And lastly was, I think, input to even give the main characters a little more voice in terms of having them each have their own idiosyncrasies, some slang words they would personally use a lot. And so going back in the second or third draft and layering a little, giving a little more individual personality to, the main characters.
How now, from the moment you actually really sat down, so to speak, to work on this book to completion, how long did it take you?
A long time.
That's open-ended.
No, I would say it went in a couple spurts. The first draft probably was a year. Then it sat, for 6 months, and then probably another 6 months. So it was a couple years.
That's a big project, but I mean, you were given us a 300-page book, you were very productive getting it out that quickly. When you're thinking about the writing process, what do you use to motivate yourself? You have a full-time job. Where do you carve out the time and the motivation and maybe even the environment to say, okay, Clive, it's time to start writing now?
Well, part of it is just my situation. We're now, semi-empty nesters.
Okay.
And so, when the kids were home in high school or before then, there just wasn't time to do it. And so that was one thing that changed that made that easier. Second is just learning to give up more some of the shows I watch. I still watch television, but I reduced, what I watched. That freed up some time. I have a cabin in the mountains, we do, and going there would be an easy environment, to work on it.
Almost escaping the bonds of reality.
And, our home is situated where we have an office inside the home. I mean, I work in an office location outside the home, but having an office in the home is just a nice, secluded place to write. And that worked well. And often doing it later at night.
So you're a night writer. Interesting, because a lot of people will talk about writing first thing in the morning. You find the night is your more creative period?
Well, what I will do in the morning, I found my ideas, I would either lay in bed to go to sleep, or just when I'm waking up but not actually having the courage to jump out of bed yet, I would think about, okay, what am I going to do about this? Or what am I going to do about that? And so I would try to think through things, for 10-minute intervals then. But then the sitting down and writing I would often do, after my wife had gone to bed.
So you're very Pablo Picasso. Is the ideas pop into your head usually at night or as you're waking up? I take it you keep a pad handy to jot thoughts down?
No, I still keep it in here. That's a dangerous thing.
Now, you're an experienced author, and you've just mentioned that you'll be bringing out another book, which I'd like to talk to you about for a moment. What would you do differently now? If you were to go back and start writing Doris Bridge all over again, what are some of the things you'd do differently?
Well, I think certainly I probably would map out the characters a little more ahead. Still be willing to change them, but map them out a little more. Bring in the editor, earlier on, and I think beyond that, the main thing I did with this is make sure that I had a strong story in mind. With this, I did initially. When I thought about writing, 20, 30 years ago, I didn't. I've been asked a lot after I did this book, well, when are you going to do another? My initial answer was no. It took a lot out of me to write this.
Really?
And I didn't think I would. And I had some ideas about books, but none that motivated me or gave me the passion enough to actually do it. And then all of a sudden the idea came with the one I'm working on now, and then I thought, well, I have to do this.
Any hints as to what it might be about or when it's coming out?
I probably will have it done at the end of the year, a little after that. It's not going to be in the 70s. It's not going to, I had people say, well, are you going to do a sequel? Life's too short to write for me about that same thing again. I wanted to do something very different. It will work in one locale of that. Part of the story in Doris Bridge takes you out into the Black Rock Desert. This is going to go out there again, but it's going to be in current setting with some twinges of paranormal in it too.
It sounds like it's going to be really exciting. You have to let us know when it comes out. We'll bring you back on to tell people about your new book. Is there any other advice or counsel you'd care to give to our viewers about tools, tips, techniques that you feel they can learn from you to help their writing abilities?
Well, probably the best thing they could do is not listen to me.
I'd have to disagree with you.
I have no authority, but I would say I think having the passion for a strong story is more important than the style. I am not a gifted writer in terms of prose, and I don't pretend that I am. I think, though, if you have a good story to tell, and you can picture yourself as a storyteller, that to me is what you want to do.
Okay.
And that'd be my advice: is don't depend upon your ability with prose. Depend upon your ability to come up with a compelling story.
I think that's very excellent advice. It reminds me of the business analogy: better to have an A team and a B idea. In this case, it's have an A story and the B prose writing in order to ensure that you're going to pull the readers in. A quick side question: you mentioned those history chapters that you put in. Did you feel those helped pull the reader along so they wanted to continue the story? Was that one of their device that they did for you?
Part of it was just my own personal passion about it, and probably making the reader suffer through my passion. When I say that, I think young adults have a hard time reading through it.
Okay.
When the feedback I've gotten from young adult bloggers or that was they liked the story in the current tense. They didn't like all the past history.
Okay.
The adults who read it loved the past history.
Different audiences responding to it.
Yeah, so I guess if you're writing young adult, and here I was trying to appeal to both audiences. They probably get enough history in school.
Will your next book be targeted at the same audience, or are you writing it for an older audience?
Probably both again.
Okay. Well, I'm very much looking forward to seeing it. Now, as you know, we're coming to the end of the show. I would like to invite you to pull the pineapple. This is a tradition we've established with our guest authors where we invite you to pull that pineapple and add your book to our growing shelf of authors who've given us the pleasure to interview. Would you be kind enough to do so?
I am honored to add Doris Bridge.
Thank you so much, so very much.
And I will carefully do so.
And as I've shared with you, our guests will be able to learn more about you on the KAZV TV website. In closing, I'd like to thank our guests for being with us here today, and to also thank author Clive Riddle, author of Doris Bridge, a very compelling and fascinating crime mystery which intertwines the conflict between father-son with rural legends and many other elements. To learn more about Clive and his book, please visit the KAZV TV website. And until then, thank you for being with us at Central Valley Writers Workshop. We look forward to seeing you again. Have a wonderful day.